Welcome to the Shared Practices podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Richard Lowe, and I've got with me here George Hariri, and we're going to be interviewing or hearing the interview with Matt Porter, which is a round 2 for us. So George, how's it going today?
Doing good, Richard. I think our listeners are going to get a great insight. Matt Porter is a really, really smart broker from here in the Valley where I am. Season 2, episode 5 was his first episode with Richard, and I think he just comes back with a great episode the second time.
Well, I told him, I was like, hey, my co-host is in the Valley. You guys should connect. So the onus now is on maybe you or him. I don't know, but I think you guys should meet up in person. I think you'd really like him a lot.
I'll reach out to him. And, the point I want to say to our listeners, I think brokers, we give them such a bad reputation on the show. Maybe the 3 episodes with Hunter kind of did that. I've not had the best view of them, but Matt, listening to this episode, it's just amazing how much thought and 10 of hours go into his valuation process that he breaks down for us. And so I think for you, at least I got a really great appreciation for guys like Matt that value practices.
Well, and I think that's a great point in that Matt is not an average broker. He is a cut above the rest by far. And this episode, so last time with him, we went into this idea of goodwill and how to preserve that goodwill and how much negotiation is appropriate versus kind of give and take. And this episode, we go into valuation from a broker's perspective. So I like Dr. Hunter Smith. He went into valuation from a buyer's perspective, how we should value a practice based on like what we're looking for. But this is like how a broker has to break this down. So I found this really insightful because it's slightly different and the nuance makes a difference. So before, I go on too much and get caught up into it, let's just head over to the interview. But this is Matt Porter with Menlo Transitions. Okay, we have back with us today, Matt Porter. Matt, thank you for coming back on the show. I loved last episode. I've gotten a lot of good feedback. I learned a ton. I had a blast. So thanks for coming back on.
Glad to do it.
Okay, well, we left off having really dived into this idea of goodwill and what that means to protect the goodwill and not ruin it through negotiation. And we wanted to talk about how to value practices because you said you hate the percentage of collections and it seems like everyone hates it. But then again, like I just heard someone last week it was a couple of weeks ago who was like, yeah, it's usually 66% of collections. And then you charge someone someone charges you for a valuation and then they come back at the end of this valuation and it's like a couple percentages off from that 66%. So it's like, well, just it's a good ballpark. Just use that. And I disagree. And I think you disagree and Hunter disagree. The people that I really respect think there's a little more nuance to it. So I want to hear your perspective as a broker. What do you do step by step to value a practice and how you put together that valuation versus kind of what we get from an average broker? And I'd kind of put you above average, having seen your documents and seeing the other brokers' documents. Maybe we can start there. I haven't even let you talk yet. So, but welcome to the show.
Okay. Thanks. Well, that's quite a setup for me. I'll kind of tackle it one question at a time. I'd say what I gather and what I look for in evaluation has been a process of iteration for me over the years. My formulation and my methodology that I use in my appraisal now is much different than what I did 3, 4+ years ago.
Okay.
And a lot of that is born from experience doing transitions and actually transacting the practice sales and keeping in good contact with buyers of these practices years afterwards to get good feedback saying, hey, what really worked well in the transition? Where did you find value? Seeing the success or sometimes not having success of practices after transition, trying to identify which key metrics are indicative of future success and which facets of the practice are more important than others. And the biggest challenge that I've struggled with is figuring out how to ascribe a value to the qualitative factors of a practice.
Okay.
We talk about percentage of collections. That's the real rough rule of thumb. And if you've got 5 seconds or less to put a ballpark value on a practice, I'd probably default to a percentage of collections.
Sure.
But if you have any more than 5 seconds to look into a practice, you need to take the percentage of collections off the table in terms of figuring out a valuation.
So just set that aside. Let's ignore that as even a legitimate valuation method for now.
Definitely not one that dictates the value.
Okay.
So where I've come to, the place that I've come to in terms of my valuation, my methodology is this. I first approach the practice and I look at the financials. I'll look at usually it's the last 3 years financials. And I want
and when you say financials, like what are the specific documents that you care about and weight the most? And then what are kind of like it's nice to have kind of qualitative stuff after the fact?
I start with just pure financials, accounting documents. So what their CPA or their accountant or their bookkeeper is going to have. And I like to have a tax return and an accompanying profit and loss statement. Sometimes the tax returns aren't very descriptive. You can lump a lot of costs into salaries. Salaries will be one line item on a tax return. On a practice doing $1 million in collections, that could be $270,000.
Okay.
You need to know a little bit more than that. I want to know how much are the hygienists paid, how much are the dental assistants paid, how much is going to the office staff. Those are important things to know when you're doing evaluation. So a tax return is important to have because those are the end-all, be-all number. But it's important to also have an accompanying profit and loss statement that has costs broken down into subcategories more detailed.
There's two things I want to ask with this. So this is just revealing some of my ignorance. The practice itself has a tax return, and then the doctor has a tax return. And do you ask for the practice's tax return or the doctor's tax return or both? Yeah. How does that work?
That's a great question. About 95% of the time, the practice has its own tax return. It's either a partnership or an S Corp or a C Corp, and they file their own tax return.
Okay.
About 5% of the time, the dentist, and I see this, I have a practice now that I'm transitioning where the dentist is 71 years old, very small mom and pop operation, very, very old school, simple guy. And he's always filed it as a schedule on his personal return. That's the worst.
That's like me running a podcast and like getting my personal expenses and my business expenses all like mixed up and a big mess.
Yep. And it's really hard to tease out the numbers. So you're right to ask the difference. About 95% of the time, the business will have its own tax return. And what you want to ask for is the business tax return.
Okay.
You really don't need the personal return at this stage. And you don't want to ask for something so personal as a personal tax return because that's going to have all other kinds of information that's not pertinent to the decision.
Sure.
And sometimes people are going to feel a little uncomfortable about sharing their personal tax return with a prospective buyer, especially at an early stage of due diligence.
Well, let me ask you a question here because someone brought this up that I'd never thought of this before. And this is related to the personal tax return, but being a practice owner, you have all of these tax shelters and, you can expense things off in the business tax return that you're benefiting personally from. And so it looks like an expense. They were saying when the ADA gives statistics on how much dentists make, that's census data. And census data typically relies on personal tax returns. And therefore, you are underrepresenting how much practice owners actually make versus what they say to the IRS that they make based on all their write-offs. Is that correct?
100%. That is absolutely accurate.
That was like such a light bulb moment for me because like you see these like average dentist incomes coming out of the ADA and you're in dental school and you have $400,000 of student loans. You're like, how can the average dentist be making this? Like even the ones who are doing really well and the ones who are really struggling, how does that average out to, 120 or 180 or somewhere around there? But once someone said that, the light bulb turned on. Oh, they're actually making more money. They're just not reporting all of that as taxable income because of protections and write-offs.
And I'll take it one step further. Remember, you always have to look at this as practice owner wearing two hats. You're a provider and you're a business owner.
Okay.
A lot of the time, if the business is big enough, you're paying yourself a W-2 or however you're paying yourself as a provider, but there should also be a healthy chunk of profit each year from the business, that's probably not being reported in the census either, because that's profit from the business ownership, not dentist income.
Interesting. Okay. So even though the dentist is making that money, the census data might be both smart enough and stupid enough to not factor that in as a dentist's income. It's like, it kind of is more accurate, because if you were just working as a dentist, that's what you would get paid. You wouldn't get that business owner, but it's also kind of dumb because a good portion of dentists are practice owners.
Right. And that's a great segue and lead into maybe the next step in what I do from a valuation approach.
Okay.
So I'll get the tax return and the profit and loss statements. When I look at the last 3 years and I line them up and I itemize out the expenses, and then I go through and I add back to the profit for the cash flow any what I call owner discretionary expenses.
How could you tell what those are? Like
experience.
Okay.
And I'll list through what those are. They're fairly common. There's about 5 or 10 of them that are fairly common. Automobile expense. A lot of times you'll take a mileage deduction, or you'll take the physical depreciation of a vehicle. The oversimplification is you're going to see an automobile expense on the tax return. That's not an expense that you as the new practice owner are going to incur at the same level as the previous owner.
Right.
They could be driving a Tesla and writing off a Tesla. You may drive a Honda Civic.
I think you have to drive a Tesla if you want to practice. Isn't that like part of how it works?
Yeah, if you're in Arizona, that's true.
Okay.
But it's just for the blue plates. It's not for the car itself. It's just for the blue plates in the HOV lane.
Yeah, that's true. Okay.
So automobiles, one, there are certain non-cash expenses that you'll see on a tax return: depreciation, amortization. Depreciation, hopefully your listeners at this point have a rough idea of what depreciation is.
You know, we haven't gone into that. We went into that a little bit, you and I, but just like refresh that real quick for someone who's just like tax noob.
Okay. I buy a practice and we're using really simple numbers. The IRS says that after, say, 10 years, the practice is worthless.
That's mean.
Used up, the chairs have had wear and tear, and in 10 years, they're going to be obsolete and I need new stuff.
Okay.
So if I paid $1 million for that practice and the IRS says it's going to be useless after 10 years, I can depreciate or take a write-off on my taxes equivalent to $100,000 every year for 10 years. Remember, the practice is worth $1 million, and in 10 years, it's worthless. So the value goes down by $100,000 each year. So I can show that as an expense on my taxes. It reduces my taxable income, but it's not a cash expense. I'm not really losing money each year, and I'm not spending money towards depreciation. So just remember, depreciation is a non-cash expense. It's tax advantage for you, but it's not really an expense that the seller's incurring. So you want to add that back to the cash flow. What I mean by that is if the profit of the practice was $250,000 in that tax year, but there were $60,000 in depreciation expense, your real income that year should be $310,000.
Okay, so you can just add depreciation right back on the top line profit.
Yep.
Okay.
And automobile expense, you'll add that.
Okay, those are probably the two easy big ones.
There's a couple others, and what you're really trying to do here is normalize each practice. Remember, the ADA is trying to do that when they're giving you their average income statistics, but each owner has different personal expenses that are somewhat business related that they're writing off as a business expense. You want to be able to compare apples to apples, a practice in one part of town for a practice in another part of town to a practice in another part of the country. So the way you normalize it is take out any of the owner specific expenses. So let me keep going through the list. Meals, entertainment. You'll see some guys that write $20,000, $30,000 a year in meals and entertainment, and others that don't write off any of it.
Okay.
You know that Richard Lowe, when you go buy a practice, you're probably not going to spend $20,000 or $30,000 a year in meals and entertainment. And let's be honest, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. The last guy probably didn't really spend $20,000 in business-related meals and entertainment either.
Well, every date night, if his wife is part of the practice, then they're obviously going to be talking about the practice and the financials and planning and strategy, right?
Sadly, that's probably your date night. That's probably accurate.
Christine would kill me, literally. She's so sick of it all. Anyways.
But point being, A lot of those expenses aren't really pertinent to the practice and or aren't part of the core business of the practice. They're
okay. So what's the next strategy?
One? Travel.
Okay.
Continuing education. Some guys are spending, the difference. Some guys are CE junkies and go all over the world to do things, and other guys are just taking online courses and a couple of
hitting the bare minimum. Yep. Yeah. Okay.
Let's see what else. Those are the big ones. The other thing you want to add back is interest expense. Because just like valuing a house, if you were going to buy my house, my mortgage payment or my balance on my home loan has no bearing on what the home is worth and what you should pay for it.
Okay. Let me try and list those back real quick.
Great.
So we had depreciation and automobile are two big easy ones. Meals and entertainment, travel, CE, and then interest expense. So that's like 6 of them that you could probably shelter a good chunk of money in each of those. And so you add all that up. And if they're brokered, say that, I'm assuming that someone else has already normalized it correctly. If I'm checking, maybe they missed something or they forgot to factor it into the right place.
Yes. And
quote unquote.
Here's what you want to see, because you're hopefully going to be looking at all practices available. Some will be sold directly by the owner. Some will be sold by brokers. So it's important for you to kind of normalize what everyone's giving you and standardize it, because owners of these practices may not know to do those things. And so the cash flow is going to look artificially low if they didn't add back some of those expenses. Conversely, I've seen brokers that are a lot more aggressive in adding back expenses. Go so far as saying, hey, there's 3 dental assistants in this office, but you really only need 2. So why don't you subtract $27,000 a year in salary expenses? And this guy's using a consultant at $35,000 a year, but you don't really need a consultant, so you can add back $35,000 a year.
So that's upping the value because now it looks like it's more profitable, but really these are legitimate expenses.
That's right.
Okay. So just double check and compare apples to apples, non-listed versus listed practices. Okay. So that's step 1 is to normalize the tax and P&L data.
The last thing you want to add back is the dentist salary.
Okay.
Because what you want to see at the end of the day is a cash flow number. And that cash flow should include the business profit and the employer profit.
Okay.
Remember, you're wearing those 2 hats, dentist and business owner.
So this is assuming we are a single doc who is working in the practice and we're buying this practice so that we can produce in the practice and we can own it. So we're going to take home both revenue streams or income streams. So we need to have all of those factored in together.
That's right. I'll give you the very simple example. A practice that's collecting $1 million and has 60% overhead. That leaves $400,000 in income. Well, some dentists may pay themselves a $100,000 salary and then recognize the other $300,000 as business profit. Another dentist may pay himself $200,000 in salary and see $200,000 in the business profit. And any one of those scenarios is fine. That's all dependent on their CPA's advice and their particular tax strategy.
Okay. So it's not like they're avoiding taxes or anything weird. They might just be, they're legitimate. It's a good strategy. And it's not like they're being shady one way or another. That's just how they're filing their taxes.
That's exactly right. So what you need to do is make sure you're looking at the combination of both salary and business profit, because what you're buying is both. You're buying a job and a business.
Okay. So then we're going to have this number, and this is going to kind of reflect like a true overhead, like you just said, where everything's normalized, everything's added back in, and you've got kind of the true expenses of the practice versus the true cash flow to the owner or dentist. What do you do with this number now?
That's a great question. So that feeds into my quantitative portion of the valuation. I use 2 metrics. I'll look at that number. There's several different terms that are often used interchangeably to define it. It could be called net income of the practice. It could be called cash flow of the practice, profit, or sometimes guys will get fancy and use the acronym EBITDA.
But EBITDA would just be the owner profit, right?
Both the owner profit and what you're paying yourself as a doctor when you're looking at a simple single doctor office.
Okay, because that's different than how I've seen it done. Because like I've seen people looking at EBITDA as if I were a multi-practice owner, after paying this other doc to be an associate there, then the take home is the EBITDA. So in your mind, though, that's less of a definite distinction.
That's right. It doesn't, as long as you know if you're talking before doctor compensation or after doctor compensation, EBITDA is EBITDA. You just need to put an asterisk and say, hey, this is after the doctors are all paid 30% of their operative collections, or this is total profit before doctor income.
Okay. And so I guess the idea is that people may not agree with the way that you use a given term. So make sure you know what they're talking about and what you're talking about.
Yep.
Okay, cool. Cool.
So you'll take that number, that cash flow number, and let's keep the very simple example, practice collecting $1 million and the combined total net income or cash flow is $400,000.
Okay.
So I use a weighted average of two different metrics. I use a multiple of net income.
Okay.
And I do use a percentage of collections. And the reason why I use that as one of the factors in my appraisal methodology is because it's so prevalently used by all the other consultants and advisors. Lenders, that's right. The lenders hold very fast to that number. So even if I, as an appraiser, wanted to get away from it altogether, I'm stuck and I'm somewhat restricted by those.
Having access to your own 3D printer via the Form 2 from Formlabs makes it so easy to print your own guides that you do it for every patient. Not because you need to, but because it will shorten your treatment time. Here's Dr. Paul Johnson about why he thinks that's so important.
For me, I always, the patient always comes first. And we have plenty of literature to back up that the amount of surgical time that you spend, there's a direct relationship to the amount of postoperative pain that patient might have, or even, this may be more anecdotal, but the more risk of secondary infection.
Sure.
So my philosophy is if I can get in there, put in an implant that's faster, more accurate, and is more comfortable for the patient, then I would say that's the standard of care we need to be working towards. And I think having a 3D printer in-house is that's really what's pushed us over the edge, and now it's affordable. And
okay.
I think before you're looking at $300 or $400 for a guide, and with using Blue Sky and using a Form 2, you're looking at $24 at the highest for including export fees, that's including material fees,
2 parts, and exactly. Materials and everything. Yeah.
So all that led up to this is it's just been a lot of serendipity that I've had the experience with 3D printing. I've had the experience with designing stuff and engineering things, and I've really enjoyed it.
If you're curious about all the things that a Form 2 can do for you in your dental office, go to formlabs.com/shared practices. There's actually a button there that says request a free sample. If you click that button, it pulls up a menu of all the different materials you can print on the Form 2, including dental surgical guide resin. By ordering any of those samples, you're actually supporting the show by showing Formlabs that people are listening and willing to take action. So go to formlabs.com/shared practices and request a free sample. There's only so much you can do to change the entire industry, Matt.
Yeah, give me some more time. But for now, I understand that I still need to use their methodology a little bit.
Okay, gotcha.
In that same practice, I then use a high and a low range. And the high and low range is based on my local market knowledge. So this is important because a lot of times I had somebody the other day who brought me an appraisal that was done on a dental practice by a certified appraisal. It was someone who has the technical background and training and certification in business appraisals. But that was the first dental appraisal they'd done in 4 years. This is very important to remember. The true arbiter of value is supply and demand. And that sounds very textbook, but what it means is the practice is worth what a buyer will pay for it.
Right.
And
in that market at that point in time.
That's right. So I use my high and low ranges, and that's a constantly adjusting range based on the transactions that I'm seeing in the transactions that I'm doing here in the market.
Okay, so if you're willing, let's take a time frozen slice of the Phoenix Metro right now. What are those ranges, if you're comfortable sharing them?
I am. So on a percentage of collections, if you go back to your statistics class, do you remember their standard deviations?
A little bell curve.
Yeah. So I would take about maybe a 1.5 standard deviation. So you're going to capture about 75 or 80% of the market will be contained in 65 to 85% of collections.
Okay.
So that's my low range, and high range is somewhere between 65 to 85% of collections.
85. Okay.
And then I use the multiple of net income, and I'll usually put that between 1.7 to 2.5.
Okay. So for our $1 million practice, that would be, you said 65 to 85, or what'd you say?
Yeah, 65 to 85.
So that'd be 650 to 800,000. And for the multiple of net income, let me think. Can you do the math? Let's see. 400,000 times 2.7, did you say?
1.7. So that'd be
1.7. Okay. 680 to, and then what was the high end?
About 2.5.
2.5.
That'd be $1 million.
Okay. So the multiple of net income gives a little higher value for this practice because it is profitable.
That's right. And that's what that means, that the methodology is working the way it should, because a practice with less cash flow is worth less than your percentage of collections can really define.
Okay.
So
and that's why we don't like that number. Okay, go ahead.
That's right. And I'll take an average of those two. So I take the percentage of collections and the multiple of net income, and I average those two numbers on the low end, and I average those two numbers on the high end.
Do you average them just like 1-to-1? You don't weight one more than the other? Okay.
No, I played around with that over the years, but it's just sometimes it's getting too cute. For the sake of valuation, I like to keep it simple.
Okay.
So that'll give me a high and low range, and I'll let you crunch the numbers.
Oh, dang it. Where's my calculator? I didn't even write these down. So let's say somewhere like, we said like 680. So let's say like 670 to, we said 85.
We're somewhere between,
like 925,000 or something like that.
Yep. So that's a pretty big spread, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay. So how do we go from 670 to 925 and just, throw a dart at the wall and find something in between?
That's right. You got it.
Okay. Easy. Done.
It's just, after that, you just go on feel. I mean, if you like it, if it looks good curve appeal.
This practice just feels valuable.
Yep. If you go in and you say, man, that's a really nice waiting room. I like this office.
or it's got a lot of shiny toys.
Yes, exactly. I saw one the other day that had iPads in every office. And I figured, well,
yes,
this practice is worth at least $50,000 more than it was before the iPads.
That's like the reverse of granite countertops. They say when you're trying to sell a home, if you pay for granite countertops, it'll never pay for itself in the valuation. Maybe it'll sell a little faster. But so the iPads is the other way around. If you have a dental practice and you buy like 10 iPads right before you value it, that will definitely 3x, 5x the investment 8X. In the iPads, 8x of the iPads. Okay, good.
So those are the things to be aware of. You'll start with the numeric to give you a high and low range, and that's a very broad range.
Okay.
That really takes into account the low range is if it's a heavily Medicaid practice, if it's a more transient patient base, if it's not digital, if it has old equipment, if it really doesn't have a solid hygiene department, then it's on the low end. But if it's a nice fee-for-service and Delta Premier office, if it's all digital and paperless, if they have a nice cone beam, if it's in a good part of town, if the staff has tenure and stability, then the practice values on the high end of that range. Now, that's usually the extent of even a half-decent valuation by most consultants or brokers. But here's where, over years and years of refining this, I took it a step further. I'm a numbers guy. And so I said, I don't like just using a couple touchy-feely points and saying, okay, this is on the high end or this is on the low end. How do you determine if it's on the high end or low end? And how do you put a numeric valuation to that?
Okay.
So what I did over time is I took a list of about 10 qualitative factors and I put a value on a scale of 1 to 10 in each one of those qualitative factors. That number helps move the needle between the high and low range. So,
okay, so
do you
so
mind if I run down what some of those qualitative factors are?
That would be awesome. And so do each of them have a weight per se, or what's or more importance?
Yes, I have weighted them differently, and if you want, I can read it from most important to least important weighting.
Let's do that.
Okay. So for me, the most important is going to be the collections trend, the type of equipment that's in the facility, and the staff tenure.
Okay.
Those are so key to understanding the viability of the office and the likelihood of future success.
So staff tenure, here's a Facebook example I saw just like 2 or 3 days ago. There's a guy who's buying into a fee-for-service practice, and it's an older doc. Staff has been around. The team caught wind, and it's a smaller practice too. Like I think 3 non-hygienist team members, and 2 of them, I think the front desk and maybe I don't know who the other person was. They came to the new owner and said that they want a retention bonus, like 10 grand a piece over like 6 months. So they're like holding this guy hostage before he's even bought into the practice. So it's this fee for service practice, and he's basically going to have some immediate turnover because these guys aren't staying. You can't sit there and demand a retention bonus from the new owner and expect that to go well.
You absolutely can't do that, and that's a big red flag. Just in terms of the team dynamic. Listen, you give the 10 grand now, it's going to be something else tomorrow.
Oh, that would be so awful to walk into that. So we everyone on Facebook, there was like 100 posts on that, like just of all of the people's opinions of what to do with those 2 staff members. So that was good.
Well, I can't overemphasize the importance of good tenured staff.
Okay, so the top 3 were good tenured staff, technology, and trends in collections, you said?
Right. You don't want to see 3 years of declining successive collections. If the practice went from, we're still sticking with our same example of $1 million in collections in the most recent calendar year. So let's say over the last 3 years, it's gone from 1.3 to 1.1 to $1 million.
Okay.
That's a red flag. There's something fundamentally changing in the practice. And sometimes it can be as simple as the seller saying, hey, I only worked 46 weeks last year, and the year before that I worked 49, and the year before that I worked 51. Okay, maybe. But usually there's something else going on there. And the reason that's an important metric is because banks have real heartburn with declining collections.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
3 years, their real rough rule of thumb is for the banks that specialize in dental loans, if you see more than 2 years, so if you see 3 years of successive collection decline, and or if you see a decline of more than 10% in the last year, that usually triggers the bank to require the seller to carry back a portion of the financing. That's the bank's way of saying, man, this is pretty risky. We don't want to take on all the risk. The seller will need to loan you some of the money for this purchase.
Okay, so that's not just important for the valuation and for knowing if it's a good practice, like literally to get lending. If you've got a practice with declining collections, you might not be able to get the full purchase price.
That's exactly right.
Okay, so that's a big deal.
Yep. So those things are... Go ahead.
And I was just going to ask on the technology. I mean, the technology is one of those things that you can point to and say, this was a direct purchase of, 50 grand or 100 grand for this cone beam in the last year or 2 years, and you're not going to have to buy a new one of these versus a very outdated practice with you're going to need to buy all of this stuff. So it's kind of almost like an immediate expense if that's important to you and how you're going to practice.
That's exactly right. The big one that I see is converting to digital. And
how much does that even cost? Like I don't even know.
That's like you asking me, how much does a new transmission cost? I mean,
how much does a new transmission cost? Tell me.
It's all over the place. A really, really rough starting point would be $40,000.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Well, because you have to get at least one computer and maybe 2 monitors in each operatory.
Yeah.
You buy a digital sensor. If you buy a new sensor, a Planmeca or a Dexys, that's going to run you anywhere from $7,000 to $15,000 plus the service agreement. You're sometimes going to have to buy a version of the practice management software, Dentrix or something of the like. That's $6,000 to $8,000.
Just get open dental.
So,
open dental.
Right.
Sorry.
The point being you're sponsored by Open Dental now.
No, I'm not. Not yet. Maybe someday. Plus, they don't even need advertising. They're one of those free ones. So
yeah, I'm teasing. But my point being that there's a direct cost that you're going to incur either immediately or very shortly after the transition if the equipment's not up to the standards that you need to practice effectively.
Wow, I just forget that there's like still practices out there that don't use computers and have paper charts. I'm in my own little bubble right now. I mean, I have paper charts in the Army, but I just assume that's the one abnormality and everyone else is caught up. But I forget there's other old docs who haven't updated things. That's okay. Okay,
let me give you, this is Matt's personal opinion and maybe a little aside, but this is a life hack that I've seen.
Yeah.
One of the practices I'm selling right now where the guy's about 70 years old, I mentioned that he still runs all the business through his personal tax return.
Okay.
He also still schedules things by hand in a book.
Oh.
It's in there, paper schedule, turns the pages, pencils you in, eraser if they need to change. So guess what? I know almost everyone going through dental school right now, you're exposed and trained on the latest and greatest technology.
Yeah.
Right? Dental schools, Sirona and Pelton Crane, they're no dummies, man. They give everything they can, and they try and put all their technology in the schools, hoping that as soon as you get out of school, that's what you're familiar with, that's what you're comfortable with, and that's what you're going to need to purchase or buy to practice.
Oh, yeah.
But you go find a practice like this old guy that's still running the business through his personal tax return, and he's still pencil scheduling things. If you can comfortably tackle the challenge and price it in financially and set aside money for that digital conversion, those practices, more often than not, are a gold mine, because that's a dentist that's been there for a very long time. He's been very consistent and probably has a really long-standing good patient following.
Huh. And maybe there's some immediate inefficiencies that could also be corrected.
Yep. So the possibility of potential is much greater in those type of practices, but it requires some heavy lifting.
So I have a question with that, and that triggers something for me, because when I was talking with Dr. Hunter Smith about valuation, and we kind of went through all of this, he talked about coming up with a range, and then the way that personally a doc would narrow it down is based on their individual circumstances. So what can I add to the practice, and how much do I need to live in this area? And, all these other personal factors, can I reproduce this production, or would move the needle? But you have to, how do you assume who your buyer is? You kind of have to come up with a non-buyer specific value. You have to come up with an objective practice value.
That's so right.
How can you account? You can't account for the potential upside of converting to digital as someone who, you might know, this could be, if done well, there's potential value here, but you can't build that in and say, it's going to be profitable when you invest in digital. Does that make sense at all?
It makes sense 100%. So there's an important distinction to make. I value a practice based on the last 3 years financials, historical performance, and the current condition of insurance, collections, equipment, staff tenure. That's how the practice is valued. That's it. End of story. I don't care who the buyer is, what their circumstance is. Just like valuing a house, I value a house based on the current comps, what's been buying and selling and trading in the surrounding area. I don't care what your salary is as a prospective buyer and if you can afford this house or not. The market is what the market is.
Right. Okay.
The things that you just asked about, the potential for growth in the areas of opportunity, I don't price that in a valuation, and you shouldn't price that in the valuation. What you should do is get a lot more excited and maybe offer a little bit above ask price in order to lock in a great opportunity if you see it. But you shouldn't pay. I have a hard time discussing this with my clients, with the sellers, because they'll come to me and say, yeah, I know my practice is worth this, but here's the areas I don't market, I don't advertise, I refer out, I refer out oral surgery. So somebody should pay a lot more for my practice. And although they're my client, I usually have to have the frank conversation with them and say, listen, you can't expect a new dentist or a buying dentist to pay for potential, because they're still the one taking on the risk of growing it and realizing that potential and the sweat and work that it's going to be required to mine the gold that's there. Your practice is a gold mine, but it still requires the mining to take place.
You didn't mine it. If you had mined it maybe a little better and more consistently right up to the sale, it would be worth more, but potential can't be factored into that value.
So don't let a seller, a dentist, or a broker overcharge or overvalue based on potential. And this is coming from a broker that sells 30 to 40 practices a year. Yeah. It's just not fair. And
it would be to your advantage to try and like convince everybody that like, no, this is worth more because of its potential, but you can't do that.
I can't in good conscience. No.
Okay, cool. No, that's really important for people to know that if someone is trying to claim a higher value based on that's not right, and you need to call them on that.
Because remember, the potential still has to be converted into actual profit and productivity through your hard work, your efforts, and an investment usually in equipment, and you're the one taking on all the risk hoping to grow it.
And assuming the market conditions stay the same and insurance reimbursements stay the same, and there's a lot of other factors that are out of their control too.
Yep. So what I would tell a buyer, if I have a practice that has a lot of potential like that, I still value it based on what the current numbers represent. Okay. But as buyers come to me and talk to me, if they ask me, hey, which ones have the opportunity, the potential for the most growth, which ones are gold mines, which ones have areas of opportunity, I would tell them, hey, this, and this have real potential for growth and improvement.
Okay.
And do what you will with that. If that makes you more excited about that practice or want to move forward with it, yes, but don't pay more for it, and you shouldn't pay more for it.
High aesthetic need patients are kind of like my worst nightmare. Luckily, Dr. Frank Spear has a course called The Aesthetic Interview that's all about setting patients' expectations and getting on the same page to set you both up for success.
Study clubs on aesthetics. And because of that, I've gotten referred a lot of patients over all those years that other people didn't want to treat. And sometimes those referrals ended up kind of being pains in my side. Now, unfortunately, I learned those lessons through trial and error, which means I treated some folks and discovered I wished I hadn't done it. But I'm going to talk to you about some of my most frustrating patients and what I should have asked in the beginning that I didn't. And what you really want to do with these questions is very simple. You want to identify your patient's expectations, because we often don't realize it, but patients don't always clearly tell us their expectations. So it's a very simple set of questions. I think you'll all relate to them if you've done any.
To get access to these questions to set yourself up for success, go to speareducation.com and request a guest pass. If you mention the Shared Practices podcast, you get an extended 30-day guest pass, and then the promo code LOW200, L-O-W, no E on the end, LOW200, will give you $200 off your annual membership. Okay, so we covered those top three. What would be your next qualitative... Every time I say that word, I struggle.
Yeah,
qualitative factors. Okay.
I look at the marketability and supply and demand factors. What that means, supply and demand is how many buyers and how many sellers are there in the market. Right now in Arizona, there are a lot more buyers than there are sellers. So that's just simple economics. Qualitatively, there are more buyers to each seller. That should increase the value of the practice. That's a qualitative facet that changes over time.
Sure. Supply and demand, Econ 101.
Yep. I also look at insurance payments. How heavy is the practice based on fee-for-service patients? How is it a heavily medicated patient base? I look at the appearance.
How did you said marketability? How do you not quantify, but assess marketability of a practice? What are you looking for?
There's a lot of practices that probably your listeners see as they're doing their due diligence and looking at practices on the market. There's a lot of practices where the collections number is $350,000 a year, in that range. Once you subtract all the fixed costs of staff salaries, rent, lab bills, supplies, the profit that's left over is maybe $100,000, $120,000. Then you subtract a practice loan, student loan payments, and then you don't have enough to take home to put food on the table and pay for a mortgage. The banks look at that and they won't lend any money. So a practice that's collecting $350,000, you have a hard time getting financing from a bank because there's not enough cash flow. So that's a practice that doesn't have a lot of marketability to it, because now the prospective pool of buyers narrows down to someone that can either have a strong co-signer or has cash in the bank.
Okay. And I'm glad I asked that, because I thought you were saying how easy would it be to market this practice and attract new patients, not how marketable is this practice trying to sell the practice itself. And I guess my first assumption would fall back under potential, maybe. Like the marketability of the practice, like if it has a good location and demographics is kind of what I was thinking. And that's not necessarily what you're talking about. You were talking about, is this going to be an attractive practice to potential buyers?
Yep. And are there going to be a lot of buyers or a few buyers? If I have a very rural practice, like the Kingman example that we used last time, the marketability is very low on that practice.
So going back to demographics and location, is that factored in later on in your list?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
So the next thing that we had was insurance payments.
Okay.
And using your bell curve example, in terms of valuation, there's kind of a bell curve in the insurance spectrum related to value. If value is on the x-axis and insurance is on the y-axis, all the way on the right, you're going to have fee-for-service practices. They're actually, even though the profitability is better to fee-for-service practice, the valuation is a little bit lower, because fee-for-service means, generally speaking, that most of those patients are going to that practice because of the provider or the experience or the relationship, and they're paying a premium to visit that practice.
And this is something that fascinates me, because I've seen people get burned buying fee-for-service practices, and not saying that it can't be done successfully, but it just seems a little riskier, and it's kind of good to hear you say that you factor that into the valuation instead of saying, well, hey, this is more profitable as a fee-for-service practice, we should be able to demand more. You're saying the other way around.
Yes.
Even though it's fee-for-service and it's more profitable, it's a higher risk and you might lose some of that profitability. So we're going to value it lower.
That's exactly right. The goodwill is a little bit stickier with the seller and harder to transfer and convert to the new owner. Because those patients that are fee-for-service are paying a premium to visit that practice and see that provider, and it's not guaranteed that they'll continue to pay a premium to see you when you bought the practice.
Especially if they have insurance and they're mailing them every time they use their benefit or they don't use their benefit, and saying you could be saving money if you went to another provider.
Right. So if you get down to the spectrum, PPOs, and especially if it's just a small subset of PPOs, that's really the most valuable practice, or the highest value when it comes to insurance dependency. And then it kind of tails off in HMO, capitation, Medicaid, state-sponsored, that type of thing.
Okay, so the bell curve goes from fee-for-service to like the right number of insurance, and then back down to the wrong kind of insurance.
Yep.
Okay. Interesting. So like what would be like an ideal, I mean, and like a range of the number of insurances that they accept? Like if they accept 30 insurances versus 5.
I'd like a mix of, if I was building my unicorn practice that doesn't exist,
right,
is, perfect in theory, I'm going to say it has a component of fee for service, maybe 30% fee for service and 70% PPO. And the PPO is made up primarily of about 5 to 8 PPO plans.
Okay, cool. So that would be a great mix to buy into.
Yeah. Now, caveat to that, if all the listeners are jotting this down and they go out to their brokers and say, listen, I want to practice that has a small component of fee for service, about 80% PPO with five plans, they're going to
laugh at you.
Waiting for 10 years. You're going to grow old before you find that practice.
Yeah.
If you find it, jump on it. It's a great opportunity, but you can't be too narrow with your criteria. I'm sharing like the theoretical perfect world ideal, but you'll learn You've got to be flexible. You have to have some compromise in the practice that you end up buying, and know that the most important factor in the practice isn't any of these things. It's you.
And that can't be factored into the valuation.
That's right.
Okay. Well, was there any other qualitative factors?
I'll run down a few others. What also is important to me is the surrounding demographics. I look at the average household income, I look at the home values, the population growth. I look at the age of the population. I also look at the new patient trend. Are there new patient, and once again, there's a bell curve. Some practices get 150 or 120 new patients a month. To me, that's not healthy, because they're obviously turning patients and don't have great patient retention and ongoing treatment plan for existing patients. Because a good practice that's retaining their patients doesn't have the capacity to absorb 120 good quality new patients into the ongoing recall system every month and treat them accurately and effectively.
They'd be growing at a rate that's not possible unless you could just add a op every couple months.
That's right. So when someone says, hey, 120 new patients a month, I think to myself, so are you losing 80 old patients a month? What's your net patient? What's your net patient growth per month?
Okay. Interesting. Okay, cool. I never thought of that.
Yep.
Okay. What's next?
I look at barriers to entry. I look at the age of facility, appearance of facility, age of equipment, and appearance of equipment, those tangible things.
Okay.
So that's a long list, but those are all of the qualitative things that I look at, and I ascribe both a weighting. Some of those are more important than others. And then I ascribe a value from 1 to 10 based on how good or bad the qualitative factor is.
And then how directly do you transfer that to your range? I mean, like literally, if you say you added up the total number of points possible in all those categories and then divided it by the difference between the high value and the low value, and then you'd have some increment of value, do you just go up that scale, or is there a little bit more to it?
Yep, that's it. So
cool.
If the scale from low to high is $300,000, if that's the spread from the low value to the high value, in theory, if a practice scored 10 out of 10 on every single one of those categories, it would be 100% practice, and it would get full value of the $300,000 of that range.
Of the range. So, if we were talking about that 670 to 925, it would get the 925.
Yep.
Okay. So that's the unicorn that doesn't exist.
That's right. And let's say it came up at 80%. So the qualitative valuation is 80%. I'd take 80% of that $300,000 spread. That's $240,000. So I'd add $240,000 to the low value, and that would be the appraised value of the practice.
That's awesome. So
simply just moving the needle high between the high and low range.
When you said you were a numbers guy and you really liked to calculate things, you now have like a system from start to finish that gets you to a practice value that you feel is fair based on market conditions, specifics, both the hard financials and the data, and also some of the intangibles that we've actually kind of quantified into tangible numbers.
Yes. And once I can put a number to everything, it makes me feel good. Right? I don't like just spitballing things as important as a practice purchase. So one thing that I want to remind is what you didn't find in what we discussed in the valuation methodology: potential. There was nowhere where we accounted for or calculated potential. That's not in there. Another thing that you won't see is projected financials. I can't stand that, because what I see, and I think, was it Hunter that you had on?
Yeah, it was Hunter Smith. Yeah, Dr. Hunter Smith.
He kept using the term pro forma, and it's probably semantics because there's a lot of different ways to use the term pro forma. But what I see a lot of times from other packages, some brokers, is true pro forma. In the finance world, pro forma is future projections of financials. So I'll see a broker's package and they'll put the current year financials, and then they only put the current year. They don't put previous years, just current year. And then they forecast out every year for the next 10 years. So you'll have 10 columns of financials, year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5. And I hate those. Because here's my problem with it. A lot of times I'll see them where they're projecting 10% annual growth every single year for 10 years.
That'd be nice.
Well, it's that easy. You just snap your fingers and the practice grows 10% every year.
Right? Isn't that how it works?
I wish.
It'd be nice.
But it's so unfair to project future financials and future performance of a practice.
It's kind of BS. Like, they're kind of just saying, this is, we're basing a value based on the future, which is unknowable and will definitely change no matter what.
And oh, by the way, it always happens that revenue, your collections grow at 10% every year, but your fixed expenses, your salaries, your rent, things like that, they only grow by 3% every year.
Oh.
So what happens to the profit every subsequent year?
It is increasing even more.
It gets disproportionately larger because your revenue is going up at 10%, but your expenses are only going up by 3 to 5%. So magically, by the end of year 10, you're just swimming in money like Scrooge McDuck, because there's so much profit because your expenses didn't go up, but your revenue went up 10% every year.
You're right. And insurance reimbursement didn't go down. None of these other negative factors occurred. That would never happen.
Right.
Okay.
So be wary of future financial projections. I don't like them.
Okay. You could almost just set that aside and say, okay, well, let's look at the actual data right now.
That's right. Look at what it's currently doing and what it's historically done over the last 3 years. And Hunter made a good point that I'll validate. The methodology used to be taking into account the last 3 years of financials and then doing your metric analysis on an average of the last 3 years. That is not the case anymore. I think Hunter said that, and I'll second that. When I describe my valuation of using the multiple of net income and the collections, I base it on the last tax year. That's it. So the previous year. So right now I'd be basing it on a 2016 tax return for a practice. So I look at 2015 and I look at 2014, and you'll find those figures in my valuation report. But all I use them for is to establish predictability and consistency of the practice, that the profit has stayed relatively the same for the last 3 years and the collection stayed relatively the same for the last 3 years.
Okay. So,
but I don't actually calculate an average of the collections of the last 3 years to equate to the value.
So that by default, it's not just weighting this last year. You're not saying that this year is like a little bit more value than the last 3 years. It's completely discarding the 2 previous years when it comes to the actual valuation.
Yeah, and it's debatable if you want to use the last 2 years or the last tax year. I don't feel definitively one way or the other, but point being, at the very most, you really only lean into the last 2 years. So
what about these partial years that you get from brokers? So you get 2016's tax returns, and then you get the P&L up to right now in 2017. What do you do with that? Like, I've seen them try and project that out to the rest of 2017. Is that the right way to do it, or what's?
No, don't overthink it. All I would do would be annualize the collections to make sure that the collections or the revenue is at about the same annualized number as the last year.
Okay.
That's it. Because expenses aren't incurred month by month. There's certain expenses. You pay your CPA once a year in January. So if you're annualizing that expense, it's going to look a lot more. Sometimes you may be 1 month behind in rent. So if we're looking at a P&L from today there's 4 months of rent. Well, they may have already paid May, so you're only seeing 4 months of revenue, but 5 months of rent expense. So your rent expense is going to show a little bit higher. So there's not a way to accurately look at a P&L mid-year and annualize it and feel really comfortable. I would lean very heavily on the last complete year because that takes into account periodic one-time annual payments and seasonality. And the only thing that the year-to-date P&L is good for, the most important thing, is just to quickly fact check the revenue to make sure that it's consistent with last year's.
Huh. That is awesome, because every time I'd see these partial years, I was like, oh, this is so complicated.
Right. Divide by 5, multiply by 12. Yeah, I know. Don't overthink it.
Okay, cool. No, that's awesome. So this has been really, really cool. And I've gotten to see an example of kind of what you do with your practice valuations. It was really funny to have these episodes with Hunter and him say, okay, you need, the production report by provider. You need, you want to break it down into cash flow and revenue and all these different numbers and the things that he cared about and the definitions that he cared about and used for valuation. And I don't see them laid out very nicely a lot of times. And then you sent over your example valuation and I was like, oh, it's all here. It's all laid out like it should be. And it makes sense. And I wouldn't have to ask you for 3 more documents and more crap. So you have obviously taken a lot of time and effort and tweaking and iterations to get this process to where you have it. The thing I want to ask you is, how long does it take you to do one of these? Like when I talked with you the other day, you were driving back from, where was it? Flagstaff or Prescott? I don't know. You were driving back from
Sedona. Coming back from Sedona, yeah.
In the vortex. And you said that you had just come back from a practice valuation. So it's not just something that they send you the data and you just like plug it into your little spreadsheet and bing, comes out in like 30 minutes. This takes a while. How long does it take you to do a practice valuation?
Easily 10 to 15 hours. And what that includes is I have a checklist of certain Dentrix reports, financials, a copy of the lease, payroll reports. I have this checklist of what I want, and I'll have one of my staff at the office send that to the dentist, have them gather it, send it back to me. Then my staff formats it for me in a readable, kind of consistent format. I review that, and then I schedule time to drive to the practice, see the practice physically, take pictures, appraise and value the equipment, and I'll do that site visit. And then I go back to the office and finalize and formulate the appraisal from there. Now, I've done appraisals for practices out of state, probably 8 or 9 different states that I've appraised practices for, and I don't go visit those practices. So I put a little bit of onus on the client, on the prospective buying dentist, and say, listen, I don't know your unique sub-market in terms of supply and demand, and I don't have the ability to go see the practice in person. So I'm going to give you a range of value instead of a specific number. And you're going to have to take that a little bit and fine tune it based on what else you're seeing in the market and how you feel about the practice when you see it. And I usually encourage them to bring an equipment rep from Henry Schein or Patterson or Benco or Burkhart to look at the equipment for them and perform that analysis in person. But it's 10 to 15 hours for me plus my support staff.
Okay. When people are like, well, I don't want to pay for a valuation and it's just going to be close to this number anyways, as we've already seen, the range is pretty big, and where you end up in that range makes a difference. So if you're listing a practice, obviously you're going to do the valuation. But if you're purchasing a practice and you are not necessarily suspicious, but you just want to make sure that the data has been normalized and that we're taking into account all of these things, it's not a bad idea to bring in a professional who does this all the time to do that. And that's not what you primarily do, but it sounds like that's something you have done in the past for people and have been able to help them out in that way.
Right. And I'll get on my soapbox here for a second. I make very little money. Once you see all the time and energy in an appraisal, I make very little money profit-wise on an appraisal. It's not my core business. It's not really what I push in terms of our services, but I'm very passionate about them, and I care a lot about doing appraisals. Number one, because I'm a numbers geek and I love diving into the numbers. But number two, a practice purchase is probably the single most important decision you're going to make in your career, more so since you decided to become a dentist, what practice you buy is the next important decision, more so than where you went to dental school, if you do a residency, because buying that practice is setting you up and buying yourself a job and a living for the next 10 to 30 years. And not all practices are created equal. There is a broad spread to the value of a practice. And if you buy a lemon or you buy something unaware, it's a very illiquid,
painful
asset. What I mean is, you buy a house in the wrong part of town, or a house that you didn't realize was near the train tracks. Yeah, that stinks. You can turn around, drop the price a little bit, and eventually someone will buy it, because there's always a buyer and there's always a seller for homes and real estate. Practices, that's not the case. So you buy a really bad practice that there were some things you didn't uncover, didn't look for, you will be so hard pressed to sell that practice and get out from under it. And you'll lose a lot of money, because the price of a practice is very volatile based on the quality of the practice. So it's not like you just price it a little bit lower, $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 lower, and somebody will come and buy it. Usually you've got to discount it a lot more than that to get the practice sold. And meanwhile, you've lost a ton of money. You're probably upside down on your practice loan, because you had to leverage it, and the loan has a prepayment penalty. So you got to pay the prepayment penalty. And on top of that, what you've cost yourself is your earning and income potential, what you could be making at another good job or an associate position somewhere else.
Yeah. So there's
that's why I care for whatever the cost is of your local or your trusted consultant to do an appraisal. It's so worth it.
And do you feel like other appraisers and brokers care? I mean, obviously you care. In my mind, you care more than all of the others that I've seen so far. I'm sure there's other great ones out there. Do you have any recommendations? Like, say that you were swamped and you were like, man, I really want to help you. I can't get to appraising this because I've got this many other listings and things going on. Is there kind of some safe names or people that you could trust or that work nationwide, or is it really local place to pay? I guess you need the local knowledge.
I feel like for the most part, you need the local knowledge. And like I said, I've taken on assignments from clients out of state because I care about them getting a good appraisal, and I don't know of anyone, and they weren't able to find anyone locally that would do a serviceable job.
Okay. So you don't want me like flooding your email with like listeners who want you to do valuations. But if someone really is in a bind and can't find someone with local valuation knowledge, they could definitely reach out to you and you could help them out.
Yep. Make sure, here's the important factors. Make sure it's not someone that's just a generalist that does valuations for even medical practices. That's too broad because there's a lot of nuance specific to dental.
You know, it's funny because like that's what we want to hear. I feel like sometimes I wonder if that's real or if there really is a lot of nuance. Because as soon as I like see a CPA who does dentists and medical, or I see a consultant who does medical and optometry and dental, like I like discount them a little bit in my mind.
No, you're right to do that.
And that's,
you're right to do that.
That's important to know. Okay. So, and what is the range? Like, what is a low range on what a valuation would cost, and what's the high end of what a valuation would cost?
I think the norm's going to be somewhere from $1,500 to $5,000, maybe.
Okay. So
that's kind of what I've heard quoted around town and nationally.
Okay. And, you know, people have seen the work and the expertise involved in this and the importance of that. And hopefully people realize. It's so funny. You mentioned real estate and how like you make an incorrect real estate decision. Yeah, it can hurt, but you can recover from that. After doing multiple of these interviews with you and a few other guys, my buddy Hunter Bennett, he is getting out of endo residency and buying a home up in Prescott, up in near Prescott and Flagstaff, somewhere in between there. And he's like in escrow for the first time. And everything feels like a really big deal to him. I'm like, dude, you're going to be totally fine. Like, yeah, it's not going to be perfect, but if it's a house you like and the area you like, it's going to work out, man. You're an endodontist now. You'll be all right.
And if it doesn't, list it and sell it.
Right.
There's always people buying real estate.
Right. Practice, not so quick of a turnaround. Well,
not so much.
I think we talked about one more episode that we could potentially do on real estate within this transaction and maybe even some of the details of closing and transitioning. So this has been awesome. I've learned a ton. This time again, I thought like, oh yeah, I've already done an episode on this. What am I going to learn? And of course, I learned a ton. So thank you for being on the show again. Can we have you back one more time?
You bet. One last parting thought on valuations.
Yeah.
Despite my best efforts to put numbers to everything about the practice, here's what you need to look at. I'll give you the number. Here's the valuation. Here's the dollar amount that the practice is worth. What's so important that can't be quantified is the fit of a particular buyer. And what I mean by that is you need to make sure that you match up with someone, whoever the selling dentist is, whether it's going to be a prolonged transition or sale walk away. You need to make sure that you fit with the practice itself and are similar to the last provider, the last owner, in terms of personality, style, clinical, philosophical. There's so many things that you at least need to know that you fit, generally speaking, on. Hunter made a great point. You want to see the production by procedure. If you're not doing the same procedures as that seller, even at a good valuation, don't buy the practice because you're not going to be able to replicate the type of procedures that you're going to do, and you don't enjoy doing the same kind of dentistry that was done in that office. So you want to make sure that there's fit and there's matchup in terms of the procedures and the type of dentistry that's done and the personality of the office. You know, you've been in a lot of dental offices. Each office has its own kind of personality.
Feel.
And you've got to make sure that that's a fit too. If you find the right fit and the seller's asking a little bit more than what the market value is, pay it gladly, because in the grand scheme of things, adding that to your loan amount spread out over 10 years is pennies. That's a crown a month. And conversely, if you see a practice that you don't feel like is a great fit for you, but it's a good deal and it's priced low, don't buy it.
So it's almost like you can't fall in love with either side of these. You can't fall in love with just the financials without the fit, and you can't fall in love with the fit without the financials.
Kind of sounds like getting married, huh?
It's a package deal.
Yeah. So that's important. Don't lose sight. What you get, the numbers are very important, but don't lose sight of the bigger picture of the fit of the office for you personally.
That makes complete sense. Awesome. Thank you so much, Matt. This has been a blast, and I'm looking forward to doing it again. And thank you. Just thank you again for being on the show.
You bet. Thanks for having me, Richard.
Awesome. Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Okay. That was one of my favorite interviews that I've had so far. Matt brought so much to the table. So what stood out to you, George?
I think for me, what really stood out was looking at the differences between Hunter's way of looking at practices and his, in terms of just kind of the metrics in and of itself. Like I think Hunter was talking about 1.3 to 1.9 times net income. And then Matt talks about 1.7 to 2.5. That's kind of a big range in my mind. So I think
so Hunter is in Arkansas, right?
Yeah, Hunter's in Arkansas. And it's funny, I actually showed the practice I'm looking at to Hunter, and he said, I'm paying a premium price for a premium practice. And I was totally okay with that, and I was very well comfortable with the idea of paying a premium price for a premium practice. Sure. And now listening to this episode with Matt, who's in my area, and listening to the numbers he was throwing out, I'm like, man, I'm actually kind of paying a fair price for maybe a premium practice. So it was kind of comforting to hear Matt go over the numbers for what is normal in the valley that I'm in. And so it was definitely comforting. Yeah.
Well, and that goes to show the value of that local knowledge, because you could do all of these numbers and plug everything in, but when it comes down to it, the market value is going to be different in every market. So you need someone with that local market knowledge. So just to go over real quick, one of the things I loved was that he went through the normalization process a little bit, because I feel like we talked about it and the documents that you would need with Hunter, but we didn't go into like the specific things that you can normalize. So I'm just going to go over those real quick as a reminder. So for the normalization, he said that you can factor out the auto expenses, depreciation, CE, meals and entertainment, travel, and interest expense. These are write-offs that you can look forward to having once you're a practice owner, but they shouldn't be factored in to the practice value and how much income that dentist is or isn't making. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and even for Hunter's valuation method, those would be considered non-EBITDA expenses. So either way, you'd be deducting them.
Right. You need to factor them out, but it was kind of cool to hear these specific ones. So if you wanted to do a little bit of DIY normalization on, say, numbers that you got from an actual actual like one-on-one working with a dentist and there's no broker in between, you could maybe do a little bit of that yourself up front to get to a ballpark and then take it to someone to do the actual valuation. The other thing I liked was his qualitative factors. So the things that he listed that he has actually weighted, but for most people, you can't really quantify these. Number one was the collections trend, the equipment, staff tenure, marketability, as in like how good of a practice this would be to buy and how easy it would be for a broker to sell it. The insurance in terms of fee-for-service PPO versus really crappy plans, demographics, new patient flow, barriers to entry, age and appearance of facility and equipment. And this takes you from that big range of 1.7 to 2.5 net income, and helps you kind of zero in on an actual value. So I thought that was really useful. What was it that you liked from that the most, George?
I like the insurance bell curve that he was talking about, where you look at, and I honestly agreed with that. I think a fee-for-service practice, I just think of it as being the most desired among buyers. But really what is the most valuable is something that's a PPO practice that is very predictable, and the goodwill will be transferred more easily because they take your insurance, So I think in terms of a transition, a fee-for-service practice, it seems desirable to buyers because they want fee-for-service practices, but the transition is not as smooth as it is with a practice that takes insurance.
Yeah, I liked his unicorn practice. It doesn't exist, but if you could find this, it'd be ideal. 70% PPO with like 5 to 6 plans, and then 30% fee for service. So there's a fee for service component, but the bulk of your revenue is going to be easily transferable.
Absolutely.
Other than that, I mean, that's an episode that like I just got just as much out of it listening to it again before this. So for any of you who were kind of blown away and thought like, wow, that was a lot of information, go back and listen to it again, and maybe with a pen and paper. But that was an episode that I really enjoyed. So thank you guys for sticking with us. Please leave us a review on iTunes if you haven't had a chance to, and we'll talk to you guys next time on the Shared Practices podcast.